The first thing I saw that morning was a sign planted in the middle of my pasture. Ridgemont Estates, Community Green HOA, members only. For a few seconds, I honestly thought it was some kind of joke. It wasn't. 20 yards inside land my family had owned for nearly 50 years, three men in fluorescent vests were hammering orange stakes into the ground. A landscaping crew had already pulled part of my fence loose. Heavy equipment sat in the grass. Fresh tire tracks ran straight across my field toward the pond. And standing beside my gate, watching all of it like she owned the place, was Patricia Caldwell, the president of the Ridgemont Estates HOA. She had a folder under one arm and a coffee in her hand. When she saw me coming, she didn't apologize. She smiled. "Good morning," she said. "We've finally started correcting the boundary issue." I stopped. "What boundary issue?" Patricia opened the folder and handed me several pages. According to her HOA, the eastern portion of my farm had been incorrectly treated as private property for years. I actually laughed. My family has owned this land for almost 50 years. Patricia barely looked at me. "That doesn't mean the records were correct." Then she pointed across my pasture. The HOA wanted my field for a walking trail, a dog park, landscaped green space, and overflow parking for their clubhouse. My land, my fence, my pond, their parking lot. I told Patricia that nobody had permission to be there and ordered the crew to stop immediately. She didn't move. Instead, she looked at one of the workers and said, "Keep going." That was the moment my anger turned cold. I stepped between the equipment and the pasture. "You're trespassing." Patricia finally looked directly at me. "No," she said, "you've been using HOA property." Then she handed me the last page. That was when I realized this wasn't just some arrogant HOA president trying to bully a neighboring farmer. They had already started the process of asking the county to recognize what they called a corrected common area boundary. If they succeeded, part of the farm my family had owned for decades could suddenly appear on paper as HOA-controlled land. And Patricia seemed absolutely certain she was going to win. So certain that they had already entered my property, already removed part of my fence, already planted their sign, already marked where their new trail would go. I wanted to rip every stake out of the ground. I wanted to throw their sign into the road, but I didn't touch a single thing. Instead, I took out my phone. I photographed Patricia, the workers, the equipment, every orange stake, every tire track, every damaged section of fence, and especially that ridiculous HOA sign sitting in the middle of my pasture. Patricia watched me and shook her head. "You're wasting your time," she said. I looked at her. "We'll see." That afternoon, I called a licensed surveyor. I expected him to confirm what my family had believed for nearly 50 years. Instead, 2 days later, I found him standing near the eastern edge of my property, staring through his equipment toward Ridgemont Estates. He checked one marker, then another. Then he walked farther down the line, stopped, checked his equipment again. His expression changed. "What?" I asked. He didn't answer. He pulled out the old county records, measured again, then slowly looked toward the HOA development, toward the place Patricia had been so confident belonged to Ridgemont Estates. I asked him one more time, "What did you find?" He lowered the survey equipment. "You need to see this." What he showed me made Patricia's attempt to take my pasture suddenly seem very, very small. Because the HOA had been right about one thing. There really was a boundary problem. They had just made one catastrophic mistake. They assumed the problem was on my side. And once the county saw what the surveyor had found, Patricia stopped talking about taking my land. I never thought of my place as valuable in the way real estate people talk about value. To me, the farmhouse was simply home. My grandfather bought the property in the late 1970s, back when the road was narrower, the field stretched farther, and there was no gated entrance, no clubhouse, no decorative stone sign announcing Ridgemont Estates. The house was already old when he bought it, with creaking floors, a deep front porch, and a barn that leaned just enough to look tired without actually being unsafe. My mother grew up there. I spent most of my childhood summers there. By the time the property passed to me, nearly every corner of the land had a memory attached to it. The maple trees along the eastern edge were planted by my father. The small pond behind the pasture was where he taught me to fish. An old dirt access lane ran along one side of the property and had been used for tractors long before anyone nearby knew what an HOA was. I was 46 when all of this started. I owned a small agricultural equipment repair business and spent most of my time fixing engines, hydraulic systems, and machinery for farmers in the county. I was not a lawyer. I was not a developer. I had no interest in neighborhood politics. I wanted to work, come home, take care of the property, and be left alone. That had been possible until Ridgemont Estates was built around me. Years earlier, a developer bought several large parcels surrounding my land and started turning them into an upscale subdivision. During the early planning stages, representatives approached my family more than once about selling the farmhouse. We declined. There was never a lawsuit, never a condemnation proceeding, and never a forced sale. The developer simply redesigned the project around our parcel. For a while, that worked. My deed remained separate. My property was never added to the HOA declaration. I never signed a covenant, joining Ridgemont Estates, never paid dues, and never received voting rights because I was not a member. For the first several years, nobody seemed confused about that. Then the developer turned control of the neighborhood over to the Homeowners Association. That was when Patricia Caldwell entered the picture. Under her leadership, the HOA began sending me notices about things it had no authority to regulate. One complained about the appearance of my barn. Another mentioned my tractor being visible from the road. A third suggested my mailbox should match the architectural style of Ridgemont Estates. I ignored most of them. The letters irritated me, but they were still only letters. I assumed someone on the board would eventually realize my parcel was outside their governing documents. Instead, the board became more aggressive. The biggest change came when Ridgemont built a new clubhouse near my eastern boundary. It was an expensive project with a pool, fitness room, event space, decorative landscaping, and a large parking area. Once it opened, residents began drifting onto my land. Joggers cut across the pasture. Children wandered toward the pond. Dog owners followed an old path along my fence. Landscaping crews occasionally mowed beyond the area I understood to be the property line. At first, I treated it like a misunderstanding. I put up private property signs. I sent polite emails. I asked the HOA to remind residents that the farmhouse and surrounding land were not part of the community amenities. The board usually responded with vague assurances that they would look into it. Nothing changed. What I did not understand yet was that the HOA was not simply failing to control trespassing. Someone had started convincing the board that part of my property was never really mine in the first place. By the time Patricia planted that community property sign in my pasture, the HOA had spent months building confidence around a boundary assumption nobody had properly verified. And because I had spent most of my life avoiding arguments, they mistook patience for weakness. If you have ever dealt with an HOA, property line dispute, or someone acting like paperwork automatically makes them right, I would be interested to know how you would have handled this point in the story. Leave your thoughts in the comments, share this with someone who has dealt with a property dispute, and keep following along, because the first official survey was about to expose a mistake that had been sitting underneath Ridgemont Estates for years. The notice in my pasture should have been the end of it until the boundary question was settled. Instead, the HOA treated it like permission to move forward. 2 days later, I came home from work and found a section of my eastern fence lying flat in the grass. The wire had been unclipped from the posts, several boards had been stacked beside the access lane, and fresh machine tracks crossed the edge of the field. A compact excavator had scraped away part of the ground where the HOA wanted its walking trail to connect with the clubhouse. Nothing had been built yet, but the message was obvious. They were no longer asking. They had started altering the land. I photographed everything before touching a single board. I took wide shots showing the farmhouse, fence line, orange stakes, and clubhouse in the distance. Then, I took close photographs of the disturbed soil, tire impressions, removed fence hardware, and the survey markers I could still identify. One of the older markers was gone. That bothered me more than the damaged fence. My father had shown me those markers years earlier. I did not know whether every one of them was legally controlling, but I knew enough not to treat their disappearance casually. I emailed the HOA that evening and demanded that all work stop until a licensed survey established the actual boundary. The response I received the next morning made it clear they believed the issue had already been decided. According to the board, their planning consultant had reviewed the original development concept and concluded that the eastern strip of my property had always been intended as open space for Ridgemont Estates. They called my fence an unauthorized obstruction. They described the pasture as disputed common property. They even claimed the shed near the field might need to be removed because it encroached on land reserved for the community. What they did not send was a recorded deed. They did not send a stamped survey. They did not send a title report. Instead, they attached a colored planning map with a thick green boundary line running across the edge of my property. There was no surveyor's seal on it, no recording number, no legal description, no county certification. It looked convincing enough for a board presentation, but it was not the kind of document I was willing to surrender land over. Still, the HOA acted as if the map settled everything. Within the same week, new temporary markers appeared farther into my pasture. A landscaping crew began mowing a wider strip. One of my private property signs disappeared. My trail camera later showed an HOA maintenance worker removing it and carrying it toward a utility cart. Then came another letter. This one instructed me not to interfere with what they called authorized community access. It warned me not to install additional fencing in the disputed area. It warned me not to park my tractor there. It warned that obstructing residents from crossing the land could create liability for me if someone was injured while being forced to take another route. That was the moment the situation stopped feeling ridiculous and started feeling dangerous. Not physically dangerous, legally dangerous. The board was manufacturing a record. Every letter used the same phrases: common area, community access, unauthorized fence, disputed boundary. They were writing those words again and again as though repetition could turn an assumption into ownership. Then, Ridgemont held its monthly board meeting. I attended because I wanted the board to produce whatever document they believed gave them title to my land. I brought copies of my deed, old tax records, photographs of the fence, and the notices they had sent me. The board brought presentation slides. Their map appeared on a screen behind the table with the disputed strip shaded green. From the way it was displayed, anyone sitting in that room could easily assume the issue had already been legally resolved. The board discussed a future walking trail, a dog exercise area, landscaping improvements, and additional parking access from the clubhouse. They talked about my pasture as though I were not sitting in the room. When the question of ownership came up, they relied again on the development plan and their consultant's interpretation. No one produced a deed, transferring my land to Ridgemont. No one produced a boundary survey. No one explained why I had paid county property taxes on the same parcel for years if the HOA supposedly owned a large portion of it. But none of that stopped the vote. By a 5-to-1 margin, the board authorized the next phase of planning for the walking trail and directed management to continue treating the eastern strip as common space unless contrary documentation was produced. That sentence told me exactly what they were trying to do. They had reversed the burden. They were claiming my land first and demanding that I prove them wrong afterward. For a few seconds, I wanted to react the way they probably expected. I wanted to drag every orange stake out of the ground, rebuild the fence that night, and block the trail with my tractor. I did none of it. I went home. I backed up the camera footage. I saved every email in 2 locations. I scanned every notice. I wrote down dates, times, names, vehicle descriptions, and every place where the ground had been disturbed. Then I created a folder on my computer with one simple name: Ridgemont Property Line. The HOA thought my refusal to fight in public meant I was giving up. What they did not understand was that I had stopped arguing with them entirely. From that point forward, I was building evidence. And the first professional I called the next morning was someone the board should have hired before they ever drove a single stake into my pasture. The first person I called was a licensed land surveyor named Mark Ellis. I did not tell him what conclusion I wanted. I did not show him the HOA's colored map first. I gave him the recorded deed, the parcel number, the tax records, and every old document I could find in my mother's storage cabinet. Then, I asked him to tell me where the legal boundary actually was. That mattered to me. I did not want someone confirming my anger. I wanted someone measuring facts. While Mark started reviewing the legal description, I went through the rest of the evidence. My trail cameras had captured more than I realized. One recording showed an HOA maintenance worker walking directly to one of my private property signs, pulling it out of the ground, and placing it in the back of a utility cart. Another showed the landscaping crew crossing the fence line before the excavator arrived. A third showed equipment operating in the exact area the HOA later described in writing as community land. I saved the original video files, created copies, and wrote down the dates and times. I also saved every email from Patricia and the management company. I printed the board notice describing the disputed strip as common property. I downloaded the meeting agenda in minutes. I kept the planning map they had sent me, even though it had no surveyor's seal. Then I pulled out my deed. The problem was that the legal description was not written in simple modern language. It used bearings, distances, references to older monuments, and boundary calls that meant very little to me. That was exactly why I had hired Mark. A few days later, he came to the property with GPS equipment, a total station, marking paint, and a set of county records he had pulled himself. He started near the western edge of the parcel and worked his way around. Some of the old markers were gone. That was not unusual by itself. Properties change, roads get widened, fences get replaced, construction happens, but two old iron pins were still in place. Mark located both. Then he began comparing their positions to the recorded legal description. I followed at a distance because I did not want to interfere. For almost an hour, he said very little. He measured, checked coordinates, moved the equipment, measured again. Then he walked toward the eastern edge of my pasture. That was the side closest to the clubhouse. I expected him to tell me the HOA had pushed a few feet too far. Instead, he stopped near a landscaped slope and looked back toward me. Something had caught his attention. The boundary line described in my deed did not appear to follow the fence line everyone had been treating as the practical edge of the property. It continued farther east, toward Ridgemont. Mark did not give me a conclusion on the spot. He was careful about that. He told me he needed to finish the field work, compare the measurements with the recorded subdivision plat, and verify the controlling monuments. But he also told me not to move anything. Not the fence, not the orange stakes, not the signs, nothing. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I went to the county recorder's office. I requested copies of the original Ridgemont subdivision plat, the deeds connected to the developer's purchase, recorded easements, parcel maps, and every boundary-related filing I could identify. I also requested the clubhouse site plan and permit records from the county planning department. What I found was confusing at first. The online GIS map made the neighborhood look clean and simple. My parcel stopped near the clubhouse. Ridgemont began beside it. But the legal records were not that simple. The original subdivision plat showed a narrow strip along the western side of the clubhouse area marked differently from the rest of the common property. The developer's acquisition deeds also used descriptions that did not line up perfectly with the planning map the HOA had shown me. That raised a question I could not answer myself. So I hired a real estate attorney named Rebecca Shaw. I brought her everything. The deed, the videos, the HOA notices, the board minutes, the planning map, the photographs, the county records. Rebecca did not get excited when she saw the documents. She became methodical. She ordered a title search. She asked for the complete recorded chain of title. She requested the final permit package for the clubhouse. She also told me something important. County GIS was useful for reference, but it was not what established ownership. Recorded deeds, legal descriptions, plats, surveys, easements, and title history carried far more weight. That was the first moment I realized the HOA might have built its entire position on the wrong kind of map. The title examiner started tracing ownership back through decades of transfers. The developer had purchased most of the land surrounding my farm, but one narrow wedge-shaped strip near the western side of the clubhouse did not appear to have been conveyed the way everyone assumed. Its legal description still seemed connected to my parcel. Rebecca warned me not to celebrate yet. A title irregularity did not automatically mean we understood the whole picture. There could be an old easement, a boundary agreement, a corrective deed, a recorded adjustment, some document we had not found. So we kept looking. Then Mark called. His field work was finished. He had reconstructed the boundary from the surviving monuments, the recorded deed, and the subdivision plat. He wanted me to meet him at the property. When I arrived, he had new stakes in the ground. These were not the HOA's orange planting stakes. These marked the boundary he had calculated. I walked beside him as the line moved across the pasture. It ran east of the fence, past the area the HOA had already started mowing, past the proposed walking trail. Then it continued toward the clubhouse parking lot. At that point, I stopped. A portion of the parking area appeared to be on my side of the line. Mark kept walking. He measured again near the building. Then he checked another point. I could tell from his expression that this was no longer just about a fence. He told me he still needed to complete the stamped survey before making a final statement. But the measurements were consistent. The line did not stop at the landscaping. It reached the clubhouse structure itself. I called Rebecca before I even left the field. She told me not to contact the HOA. Not yet. We needed the stamped survey. We needed the title report. We needed the permit documents. We needed every piece lined up before the board understood what we had found. For weeks, Patricia had demanded that I prove why I was entitled to keep my own pasture. Now there was a very different question forming in the county records. And this time, the HOA was going to have to answer it. Why was part of their clubhouse sitting across my property line? The stamped survey arrived 3 days later. I opened the PDF on my computer, zoomed in, and followed the boundary line from the road to the eastern side of the property. There was no ambiguity left. The line crossed the edge of the clubhouse parking area, continued through the landscaping, and clipped a portion of the structure itself. Not the entire building, but enough of it. Enough to create a problem nobody on the HOA board could dismiss as a misunderstanding. Rebecca reviewed the survey with me that afternoon. She was careful with every word. A survey did not magically transfer ownership. It did not automatically decide every legal issue. But combined with the recorded deed, the title history, and the absence of any recorded transfer, it gave us something the HOA had never produced. A documented chain showing the land remained part of my parcel. The title report made the situation even worse for Ridgemont. The developer had acquired several surrounding parcels years earlier, but the narrow wedge near the western side of the clubhouse had never been conveyed the way their development documents assumed. We searched for everything that could have changed that. A corrective deed, a boundary line agreement, a recorded easement, a subdivision adjustment, a purchase contract, a dedication, a condemnation filing. Nothing appeared. Then the county permit records arrived. That was where the real mistake became visible. The clubhouse had been permitted using a site plan that showed the building sitting safely inside the Ridgemont parcel with the required setback from the property line. On paper, everything looked clean, but the property line shown on that site plan did not match the recorded legal boundary. It appeared to have been copied from an earlier development drawing. Somewhere during the planning process, a conceptual line had been treated like a final ownership line, and nobody caught it before construction. That meant the problem was larger than the HOA board. The developer had relied on it. The design team had relied on it. The contractor had relied on it. The county had approved the project based on documents that assumed the line was correct. But none of that changed what the deed said. Rebecca prepared a formal demand letter. She did not accuse anyone of theft. She did not threaten to bulldoze the clubhouse. She did not write anything emotional. She simply laid out the evidence. The recorded deed, the title report, the stamped boundary survey, the photographs, the HOA notices claiming my pasture as common property, the videos showing their crew entering the land. Then she made the demands. All work on my parcel had to stop. The HOA had to remove every sign claiming the pasture as community property. They had to stop representing the disputed strip as common space. They had to preserve all emails, board records, planning documents, contractor communications, and insurance information connected to the clubhouse and proposed trail. They had to provide the exact deed, easement, or recorded document they believed gave them rights over my land. And they had to notify their insurance carrier. Rebecca also demanded that no one move, destroy, or alter any remaining boundary markers. That letter changed the tone immediately. For weeks, Patricia had acted as if I were the one refusing to accept reality. Now, the board had a stamped survey sitting in front of them. Their first response was not an apology. It was an email to residents. Patricia described the situation as a minor technical disagreement involving competing interpretations of an old boundary. That wording lasted less than 24 hours. Rebecca sent a preservation notice to the HOA attorney and copied the management company. Then, she contacted the insurer listed in the association's records. The contractor that had built the clubhouse was notified too. Once insurance companies became involved, the dispute stopped being something Patricia could control with board votes and confident emails. Documents started moving between lawyers. The contractor's carrier requested the site plan and construction layout records. The HOA carrier requested the survey. The management company began forwarding archived correspondence. Then the county planning department compared the approved clubhouse plan with the recorded parcel information. They did not declare that I had won anything. That was not their role. But they confirmed there was a discrepancy serious enough to require review. Suddenly, the HOA had to answer a question they had never expected to face. If the legal boundary was where the survey showed it, what exactly had they built across it? The next board meeting was very different from the last one I had attended. There were no presentation slides about walking trails, no shaded green map claiming my pasture, no talk about unauthorized fences. The board attorney did most of the talking. The proposed trail was suspended. The landscaping expansion was stopped. The association was instructed not to enter the disputed area. The clubhouse issue was being referred to council and the insurance carriers. Patricia barely looked at me. What made the moment satisfying was not seeing her uncomfortable. It was seeing the board finally forced to use the same standard they had demanded from me. Recorded proof. Not assumptions. Not internal votes. Not planning sketches. Proof. For months, they had treated my pasture like something I was temporarily occupying. Now they were the ones facing the possibility that part of their most expensive community asset had been placed where they had no recorded right to put it. And the next people coming to inspect the property were not HOA volunteers. They were county officials, survey professionals, attorneys, and insurance representatives. The dispute had left the clubhouse meeting room. Now it was becoming a real legal file. The county inspection happened on a gray Tuesday morning. By 8 o'clock, there were more vehicles parked near the clubhouse than I had ever seen outside a board meeting. A county planning official arrived first, then a code enforcement inspector. Mark came with his survey equipment and copies of the recorded plat. The HOA brought its own surveyor. Their attorney was there too. So was a representative from the association's insurance carrier. For the first time since this started, Patricia was standing in a group where her title as HOA president carried almost no weight. Nobody cared how many votes she had on the board. Nobody cared what color the HOA had shaded the pasture on its planning map. They cared about deeds, monuments, recorded documents, permit plans, measurements, and legal descriptions. The HOA surveyor started independently checking the boundary. He located the same surviving iron pins Mark had used. He ran measurements from the subdivision control points. He compared the bearings. Then he checked the line near the parking lot. I watched from several yards away. There was no dramatic argument. No one raised their voice. That almost made the moment more powerful. The professionals simply kept measuring. By late morning, the numbers were telling the same story again. The HOA's survey did not magically move the boundary back toward my farmhouse. It came remarkably close to Mark's. The disputed pasture was on my parcel. The proposed walking trail crossed my land. Part of the parking area crossed the line. And the clubhouse encroachment could no longer be dismissed as a strange interpretation of an old map. The county officials then compared the field measurements with the permit records. The approved site plan showed a clean setback between the clubhouse and the property boundary. The actual recorded boundary showed something else. That created a permitting problem. The county did not order the building torn down that morning. They did not decide ownership for a court, but they did something the HOA had spent weeks trying to avoid. They created an official record of the discrepancy. Any planned work around the western side of the clubhouse and the proposed trail was suspended pending corrective review. No new grading, no landscaping expansion, no trail construction, no alteration near the disputed boundary. The HOA was also told to provide revised site information and documentation showing how it intended to resolve the encroachment. That changed everything. Before that day, Patricia could still tell residents the dispute was just one homeowner refusing to accept a community plan. After the inspection, there was a county file number. There were measurements from 2 surveyors. There were permit questions. There were insurance adjusters asking for records. There were attorneys reviewing exposure. The problem had become expensive. The clubhouse contractor's insurer wanted to know who had supplied the boundary information during construction. The design consultant wanted to know whether the developer had provided a final survey or a preliminary development drawing. The HOA insurer wanted to know when the board first became aware that I disputed ownership of the pasture. That last question mattered, because the email showed exactly when. Months earlier, they showed that I had repeatedly told the board the land was private. They showed that I had asked them to stop entering it. They showed that one board member had even suggested obtaining a licensed survey before moving forward. Patricia had pushed ahead anyway. That email became one of the most uncomfortable documents in the entire file. The board had been warned. They had simply decided that their planning map was good enough. The next HOA meeting drew more residents than usual. By then, word had spread that the trail project was suspended and the clubhouse had a property line problem. The atmosphere was nothing like the meeting where the board had voted to treat my land as common space. This time, the association attorney controlled most of the discussion. He explained that an HOA resolution could govern association business, but it could not create title to property the association did not own. He also explained that the association now had to address the clubhouse encroachment through a documented legal solution. That could mean purchasing land, negotiating an easement, entering a boundary agreement, modifying the structure, or litigating the issue. None of those options sounded cheap. Residents began asking questions about legal fees, insurance deductibles, survey costs, why money had been spent planning a trail before the property line was verified, why crews had removed fencing, why the board had told homeowners the pasture belonged to the community without a recorded deed. Patricia tried to frame everything as an inherited development error. That might have explained how the original clubhouse problem began. It did not explain why the HOA had entered my pasture after I disputed their claim. It did not explain why they removed my sign. It did not explain why they kept planning improvements after being asked for proof of ownership. The distinction mattered. One mistake may have started years earlier. The board's descendants had made it worse. Rebecca attended the meeting with me. She did not make a speech. She did not need to. By then, our position was already documented. She had prepared a settlement framework that focused on one thing: ending the dispute permanently. The HOA would recognize the surveyed boundary. It would withdraw every claim that my pasture was common property. The walking trail would be abandoned. My damaged fence and disturbed ground would be restored. The association would reimburse reasonable survey and legal expenses. And if the HOA wanted the existing clubhouse encroachment to remain, it would need a properly negotiated, narrowly written, recorded easement. There would be no informal permission, no vague community access, no language allowing future expansion, nothing that could later be twisted into a claim over the rest of the property. That was when the balance of power became obvious. A few weeks earlier, the HOA had been telling me what I was allowed to do on my own land. Now they were asking whether I would grant them the legal right to keep part of their clubhouse where it already stood. I had no interest in punishing hundreds of residents for the arrogance of a board, but I also had no intention of letting the HOA turn its mistake into permanent control over my property. So we kept the terms simple. My boundary had to be respected. My land had to be restored. Their claim had to disappear from the record. And anything they wanted from me after that would require my written agreement. The board no longer had the luxury of pretending it could solve the problem with another vote. The county had measured the line. The surveyors had documented it. The insurers had opened files. The attorneys were involved. Now the only question left was how much this mistake was going to cost Ridgemont before they finally accepted that the farmhouse had never belonged to them. The settlement took several more weeks, but once the county records, both surveys, and the insurance files were on the table, the HOA's position became much harder to defend. Ridgemont formally withdrew its claim that my pasture was community property. The walking trail disappeared from the development plan. The HOA removed its signs, restored the disturbed ground, repaired the damaged fence, and reimbursed most of the survey and legal expenses tied to the dispute. More importantly, the final agreement recognized the surveyed boundary in writing. My farmhouse, pasture, pond access, old farm lane, and eastern strip remained exactly what they had always been: private property. The clubhouse created the last problem. I could have pushed for a much more aggressive solution, but I had no interest in forcing hundreds of homeowners to lose part of a building because their board and developer had failed to verify a boundary. So Rebecca negotiated a limited recorded easement for the small portion of the existing structure that crossed onto my parcel. It applied only to the current encroachment. It did not create public access. It did not give HOA residents rights over my pasture. It did not allow future expansion. And it could not be twisted into ownership of the surrounding land. The irony was almost perfect. The same HOA that had tried to claim acres of my property without paying a dollar now needed my written permission just to keep part of its clubhouse where it already stood. The political consequences inside Ridgemont came quickly. Residents demanded explanations for the legal bills, survey costs, insurance claim, suspended project, and restoration work. Patricia lost her position as board president at the next election. The new board adopted a policy requiring professional survey and title verification before any future project near a property boundary. I did not walk away with some dramatic fortune. That was never the point. I got my fence back. I got my land back. I got a clean, recorded agreement. And most importantly, I got something the HOA had tried very hard to take away from me: the right to decide what happened on my own property. Months later, I could stand on the porch again and look across the same pasture my family had cared for decades without seeing orange stakes, HOA signs, or landscaping crews cutting paths through it. The clubhouse was still there. So was my farmhouse. But now everyone knew exactly where the line between them was. I did not win because I shouted louder than the board. I won because I saved the emails, preserved the video, checked the deed, hired the surveyor, followed the county records, and refused to let someone else's confidence replace actual proof. Property rights can look boring on paper, until somebody decides your property belongs to them. If you were in my position, would you have allowed the clubhouse easement, or would you have forced the HOA to remove every inch that crossed the line? Leave your answer in the comments. Share this story with someone who has ever dealt with an HOA or property dispute. Save the video if you want to come back to it later, and subscribe for more stories where arrogance runs into evidence, property law, and a boundary that refuses to move.